It seems like the only way that Republicans will have a shot at victory in the 2016 elections is to steal the election. And that is exactly what they're trying to do through a series of restrictive voting laws at the state level. Last week, Ring of Fire Radio's Sam Seder discussed these laws with author Ari Berman, so let's take a look.
All right, well, let's talk about this issue of voter suppression. This week, I think Progress had reported about a new paper entitled Voter Identification Laws and Suppression of Minority Votes. It was researchers from the University of California, San Diego, and Bucknell University, which used data to compare states with strict voter ID laws to those that allow voters without photo ID to cast a ballot. And they found a clear suppression effect on minority turnout in those strict voter ID states. I mean, I know this does not come as a surprise to you. Will this type of data have any implications other than just one more example of what we already know?
I think that this report confirms, like you said, things that we already know. There was a major study from the Government Accountability Office in 2014, and it found that voter ID laws in Kansas and Tennessee depressed voter turnout by 2 to 3%, and the biggest impact was among young voters, first-time voters, and African-American voters. And so that was consistent with both the data that we know about, but also why these laws were being passed in the first place. Because if you look at the data, it's very clear in terms of who doesn't have these IDs disproportionately, that it is younger voters, African-American voters, Hispanic voters, Asian Americans, other voters of color, lower income voters, and elderly voters, nearly all of whom, except for elderly voters, are Democratic-leaning constituencies. And so I think that people are starting to see some clarity here. However, I think that it's going to have to go beyond reports. I think we're going to have to keep spotlighting stories of people who are turned away from the polls or people who have a lot of difficulty complying with these laws so people can see what they're really about. And then also just to beat on the drum that there is absolutely no voter impersonation fraud to make these kind of laws necessary. So we're creating these new restrictions that people are being burdened by, but there's no evidence to justify them in the first place, while there is evidence that people are being turned away from the polls.
Does a study like this have any implications in any potential lawsuits? I mean, are there suits on the horizon where I mean, we certainly had some in the run-up to the 2014 elections. Do we anticipate any in the run-up to the 2016 election where this becomes, some piece of evidence, or is it just go into the ether?
I think it will become evidence. I mean, there's already a lot of reports out there that are in these testimonies where people are talking about the number of people who don't have IDs, the number of people who are turned away from the polls. So there's both expert witness testimony, and then there's also just testimony of voters themselves who have been turned away from the polls. And I wrote about one this week in North Carolina that I thought was very persuasive, the story of this 94-year-old woman, Rosanelle Eaton.
Tell us about that.
Well, this is a really remarkable story because Rosanelle Eaton is a 94-year-old African-American woman. She was someone who, during the Jim Crow era, had to take a mule 2 hours to the county courthouse where she had to recite the preamble to the Constitution word for word and then also pass a written literacy test just to be able to register to vote, something that very few people in North Carolina in the 1940s who were African-American were able to do. So she was one of the first black registered voters there. She had voted for 70 years and was also a voting rights activist. She had registered many thousands of voters herself. And then when North Carolina passed this strict voter ID law in 2013, she went through this kind of Kafkaesque odyssey to try to get her documents in order because her name on her voter registration card did not match her name on her driver's license, which is a problem that a lot of women have, and in particularly elderly women who may have been born in the segregated South, not at a hospital, and may not have had some of this documentation in the first place. And so between in 1 month,
right, there are many elderly people who don't have birth certificates.
Yeah.
There are many African Americans in the South, elderly, and guess maybe somewhere between middle-aged and what we would contemplate that also lack birth certificates, and so this is a real phenomenon. This isn't like, why wouldn't you have these papers?
It's a real phenomenon. The other thing is she had these documents, and she just tried to match everything. But to do this over the course of a month, she had to take 11 different trips to state agencies. She had to take 4 trips to the DMV. She had to take 4 trips to 2 different Social Security offices, and she had to take 3 trips to different banks, which took basically over 20 hours and 200 miles of travel, just so she could comply with a law that would have disenfranchised her after she had voted for 70 years. I mean, it's totally insane what someone like that has to go through. And many more people, when faced with this, would just give up. They would spend one trip to the DMV or somewhere else if they even were motivated enough to do that. And if they didn't get their documents in order, they would just say forget about it. But she was so motivated that she took 11 trips. But these are the kind of hurdles that people are having to jump through now because of these new laws.
All right, so give us a breakdown in terms of the Republican presidential candidates. They have all, at the top of my head, I seem to remember Jeb Bush being governor of Florida in 2000. For some reason, that election sticks in my head quite a bit. And, of course, there was the suppression and the disenfranchisement of literally thousands of registered voters. But just give us a quick breakdown of the Republican presidential candidates, to the extent that they're still in the race, of where they are on this. I mean, I guess it's to be anticipated. These are not politicians who are trying to expand the voter rolls in this country.
No, I mean, they all have awful records when it comes to voting rights. They all have either supported the gutting of the Voting Rights Act or do not support restoring the Voting Rights Act. They've been proponents of things like strict voter ID laws or cutbacks in early voting or making it harder to register to vote or disenfranchising ex-felons. You look at someone like Ted Cruz, for example, from Texas. I mean, he was an early proponent of voter ID laws. He has repeatedly defended his own state's voter ID law, where you can vote with a handgun permit but not a student ID, which has been blocked 3 different times under the Voting Rights Act, but yet he still has not given up pushing for this thing. You look at someone like Marco Rubio, who is from Florida, which had a lot of well-known voter suppression. In 2012, there were 6-hour lines at the polls because the state cut back early voting, and Rubio was recently asked in Iowa what he thought about 6-hour lines in Miami, and he responded very bizarrely, well, that was only on Election Day. First off, as if that excuses it, I mean, yes, there's usually long lines on Election Day if there are going to be lines, because that's when the election is. But also in Florida, there were long lines throughout the early voting period. So he really displayed a remarkable amount of either willful or feigned ignorance about what was going on in his home state. Jeb Bush, as you mentioned, who was governor of Florida, was governor when there was a disastrous voter purge, when many thousands of people were wrongly labeled as felons and were prevented from voting. In Ohio, John Kasich signed legislation that cut back early voting, eliminated same-day voter registration. He is a supposed moderate in the race. Chris Christie vetoed legislation that would have brought early voting and online registration and automatic voter registration to New Jersey. So all of these people, when faced with efforts to make it tougher to vote, have supported it, and they've all opposed efforts to make it easier to vote. And so it's very unfortunate that they're going around the country trying to get people to vote for them when they don't want every eligible American to cast a ballot.
And we should make a point here. Like, this is, we see some, I guess some dissent on some programs within, when these people get up to debate, we see some modicum of dissent. There seems to be no dissent here. And this isn't, as far as like a political issue goes, right? This isn't something where there's massive polling numbers which suggest that even the Republican base, it seems to me like it's clamoring. This isn't like one of their top issues, right? Voter ID laws. It's just something that somehow the entire Republican establishment has decided this is something that is uncontroversial, and we're just going to impose it wherever we are.
Well, I actually disagree with you on that. I think this has become yet another litmus test in the Republican Party. in the same way that you have to be anti-abortion, in the same way that you have to question the scientific consensus on climate change. I think that supporting things like voter ID laws is another box that you have to check. And the reason I say that is because a while ago Rand Paul said that he still supported voter ID laws, but that the Republican Party should just back off a little bit in terms of how they talked about it, because it was offending people and it was hurting their outreach to African Americans. And he was crucified